So welcome to the class on the Dead Sea Scrolls. So let's just jump right in and describe what exactly we are talking about when we talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls. I know Avi and Lydia just mentioned they saw them in Yerushalayim in Jerusalem. They were actually here at the Franklin Institute a few years ago, and Ann and I went to see them also. At least a part of the collection was here at the Franklin Institute. So let me before I get to this part, let me just say I'll be basing my remarks in class primarily on Lawrence Schiffman. He's considered the world's leading Dead Sea scholar. Interesting fellow in the sense that he's an Orthodox Jew as well. I believe he lives in Great Neck, New York, and davens at the Young Israel there. It's on Long Island. So why I'm saying that's of particular interest here is that he's approaching this purely from an academic point of view, despite the fact he's an observant man. Sometimes there are tensions between the way, as a rabbi or a religious Jew, somebody might approach an ancient or biblical text versus an academic scholar. In other words, an academic scholar would studies it the way you're studying in a university, and a religious Jew would study it in the way that you would study it in a yeshiva. So it's interesting, he really has both points of view, but he's speaking here as an academic. Okay. I just asked Scott Slomowitz about, Scott reads a lot of Robert Eiserman's work, who's also another prominent Dead Sea scholar, who at times disagrees with Schiffman's approach, and basically we'll come to it later, but basically Eiserman argues that these Dead Sea Scrolls are a little later, historically speaking, so therefore they would have been written when Christianity, it would have been a direct reference to Christianity. Schiffman's point of view is these were all written before Christianity came about. However, what it does do is it's going to give us a window into the culture in which Christianity came out of. So what exactly are these scrolls? So most of these scrolls are not scrolls like the way you think of Megillah Esther, that type of scroll, simply because they're too small. We just have little parts of them. We basically have about 8,000 scroll fragments or pieces. There's about 10 scrolls that really look like scrolls still that you could actually put on a table and unroll. And it's believed it's only been 5 to 10% have been recovered, most simply deteriorated because they were so old. Okay, and they were part of an ancient library in Qumran, of course, and it's believed there are about really 900 scrolls or so altogether. And we have the remnants of parts of these 900 scrolls. That's what we'll really be talking about here. Okay, so when were these scrolls written? So first of all, there's different ways to try to determine the age of the scrolls themselves. So first of all, carbon dating is one of the elements, or one of the methods. Paleography, which is looking at the shapes of the letters and the way the writing is developed, basically playing a little bit of detective work and basically seeing are these writing patterns or styles from a certain time period, and use that as dating. And then, of course, the simply historical content. Are they mentioning past events that already took place? Are there words used that didn't seem to originate before a particular time? This is often a way that historians try to date text, by pinpointing words or events and saying this word or event wouldn't have been used before this time period, or wouldn't have been used later than a certain time period. So the scholars believe that there are some as early as the 3rd century before the Common Era. So just to put that in historical context here, that's before this is the Second Temple period. Then we have 2nd century BCE. We're getting into the Greek time period where the Greeks swept across the Middle East and now are in control of what Israel, or Judea as it was being called. Up to that point, the Persians were the major power. And then we have some 1st century BCE. So 1st century before the Common Era brings us to think about figures like Julius Caesar, that time period. and it's bringing us to the time when Rome basically conquers Judea and includes Judea within the Roman Empire. It actually, I think it's in the year 6 of the Common Era, is actually annexed into the Roman Empire. And then we have a few. We have a few from the first century itself. First century being, as I said, when the Romans, beginning of it, the Romans annexed Judea into the Roman Empire. Yet these texts all seem to be before Christianity comes about and before the Second Temple. Christianity comes about. Let's say Paul takes the scene and really is a successful apostle in the 50s, first century or so. And the temple is destroyed in 70 of the Common Era. So these scrolls seem to be all before those events take place. And so, as I said, it's going to give us an environment in which Christianity develops out of Judaism. And the earliest scrolls, the ones dated earlier, tend to be basically copies of biblical text, whether from the 5 books of Moses or prophets like Isaiah. And there are variations in the different texts. What I mean by that is not like nowadays. If you want to read the Parsha, you read Shemot. We're reading the Era this week, or you want to read Isaiah. You simply open up a Chumash or Tanakh, and it's a standardized text. You're not going to find variations. This is in a time period where, first of all, the entire Jewish biblical canon hadn't been completed even. So you may have different versions of text where you may have one version of Isaiah uses a certain type of language and another version uses a different form of language. It's only in a scholars' debate anywhere between 90 of the Common Era and even as late as 200 and 200 of the Common Era, when the Jewish biblical canon is totally sealed and closed, and you can't really make any more changes to it. So we're going to find variations, which is going to be fascinating. Okay, so Qumran itself, for those who have been to Israel, it's a popular tourist attraction. It's not far at all from Masada, if you've been to Masada. And the Qumran community, who we're going to talk a little bit more about today, was established sometime after 134 BC. That would be the earliest dating that they established the community. And we'll talk about why they wound up in the desert. Even back then, it seemed to be the middle of nowhere, basically. And the community, we know, was destroyed by the Romans in 68, being the Great Revolt against Rome broke out in 66. So the Romans basically destroyed it in 68, bringing the community to an end. Now, the question is, why in the world were these people out there in the middle of this arid, dry area in the desert? So there's speculation. We don't know if this is true or not, but there is speculation this may have been a reaction based on Alexander Yanai's revolt. Yanai was a Hasmonean or Maccabean king, and he's around the year 100 before the Common Era, give or take or so. He's ruling. He's a Sadducee. He identifies himself as a Sadducee. The Sadducees were priestly elites, and you have a Pharisaic movement beginning to grow as well, who is made up of more common people. And the Pharisees and Sadducees had different beliefs on how certain religious rituals should be carried out. So over Sukkot, what he did is he carried out the Simchat Beit HaShoev at a water-drawing festival by pouring the water in the Sadducean fashion instead of Pharisaic fashion. Scott, do you remember what he poured it on his feet? Am I correct? Instead of on the ground?
Right. He trying to ridicule the prayer. I understand from what he pours it on his feet, as if to say, this ritual of yours is, because I think the high priest prayed for rain at Yom Kippur.
Mm-hmm.
So it was almost like, but the Pharisees wait. That's why we do the Mashiv HaRuach in Sukkot. But he didn't. So he pours it on his feet.
Okay, so thank you, Scott. Right, so he's denigrating. He's basically, Simchat Beit HaShoeva a water drawing festival, which was actually supposed to, according to the Talmud, be a great party, really. The Talmud says if you haven't been to this party, you don't know what it's like to party. But part of it was Alexander Yanai, who was the Kohen HaGadol and also king, which was a big no-no because he was not of Davidic descent. He was, as a Maccabee, he was of priestly descent, so he was fit to serve as the Kohen HaGadol. He was serving as king, which was wrong. But on top of that, what he did is at this water drawing event on Chol Hamoed Sukkot, he poured the water in a mocking way to mock the Pharisees' beliefs. The Pharisees, with their etrogim in hand, being Sukkot, pelted him with it. And he unleashed his security forces, and there was a gigantic massacre. So there's a clear tension between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. There's also it's been suggested perhaps that the Essenes, and we'll talk about the Qumran and the Dead Sea sect. Most scholars believe they were a kind of a militant's really the wrong word, but an extreme version of the Essenes. But the Essenes, basically, it's believed, probably came from priestly circles themselves, but believed the high priests in control in Jerusalem were not acting properly. They basically thought they were corrupt. They were taken with the with Hellenistic and Roman society, and they were decadent. All these type of things, accusations you have when people sometimes gain a lot of power. So the Essenes basically broke away as a protest, and it's believed that perhaps a more radical group of Essenes actually at this point broke away and set up shop in Qumran, where they wanted to carry out their rituals they felt in the proper way, as opposed to carrying them out in the corrupt fashion that the priesthood was doing, the Sadducee and high priesthood was performing in Jerusalem. So again, we don't know if that's true or not, but it's an interesting theory. And we do see from the Qumran sect that they clearly are against what's going on in Jerusalem and the temple procedures. I want to note, though, these are not the same complaints that people like Jeremiah lodge against the temple in Jerusalem. Jeremiah is basically saying his problem with the temple in Jerusalem is people are coming and they bring sacrifices, but they're just going through the motions. It's not changing them for the better. It's not really a religious experience, as opposed to I show up, I give my sacrifice, I look from, and then I go home. What they're saying here is the actual priesthood, the priests themselves in the temple are really not performing sacrifices correctly and have become corrupt. So that's why they're constantly criticizing them. Now, most of the scrolls, though, were not written at Qumran. That wasn't a place where writers got together to write. It wasn't some sort of publishing house. Most of these scrolls come from elsewhere and eventually wind up in this Qumran library. Okay. So their agenda, as I said, they're against Jerusalem and the temple. This seems to be, okay, so I copied someone twice. So who are these people? They were basically a religious community studying, to a large degree, studying these scrolls. And we'll talk about the different types of scrolls as well. And we'll see that when Josephus, the historian, who chronicles the Jewish revolt against Rome, talks about the major Jewish sects, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes, he really praises the Essenes. And as I said, likely this Qumran sect was a radical group of Essenes. So he really thinks that these are very pious people and to be emulated. He likes them much better than the Sadducees and Pharisees, by the way. Philo, who during the first century, same time as Josephus, was the leading Jewish authority in Alexandria in Greek Egypt, refers to them as unusual. And they certainly did have some unusual practices. Okay, they were, besides being a radical, possibly a radical Essene group, they were very into ritual purity. That was a big deal to them. Issues of Tuma and Tahara. They'd be very interested in being strict with all of these things. And later on, we'll see they have some fights with Pharisees, which we would think of as just really total hair-splitting, ridiculous fights. But to them, this was really very serious stuff in the sense that one group would argue that if you have a water bottle that's impure and pour it into the plate, that the impurity, if the water is impure, it only goes downwards. Others argue the impurity could go up from the water into the plate into the bottle. So which way does impurity travel? These are things they argued about, and we tend to roll our eyes at this, but back in the day, these were considered very serious things. And I'm sure later, at some point later on, thousands of years later, people will look at things we argue about today and say, really? Okay, they were also a very insular type group. We'll get to later, but they had a lot of initiation type of rituals, and they were distrustful of outsiders, and it was really an us versus them mentality. Well, we'll talk about where they were the sons of lightness and everyone else is basically the sons of darkness. This is really an apocalyptic type of group which believes the world is coming to an end. They're not interested in having children because the world's coming to an end anyway, and paradise, so there's really no need for that. So these are some of the things they believed. Now, Professor Schiffman does point out that some argue that they were actually Sadducees as opposed to Essenes, even though that's not the popular point of view. And as I already said, it's been argued Essenes are a breakaway group of Sadducees, so the line where one draws it is questionable also. Now, interestingly enough, no one knows what the word Essene really means. We're throwing the term around. The other terms, Pharisee, Perushim, comes from the Hebrew word parash, which means to separate. They were separating themselves into also a holy type of community. The Pharisaic holy community really believed that holiness shouldn't have to be limited to the priesthood. In other words, just as priests do all sorts of ablutions before performing a ritual in the temple, the shulchan, the table at home, is also an altar, so you should wash your hands before eating bread. That's a spiritual act. So they were arguing for those type of things. The Sadducees simply come from the word Sadok, who's the high priest under King Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon. So that's where the term Sadducee comes from. Okay, so why are these texts important? So it's going to give us a window into the period which produced Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity, which ultimately is the groundwork for the Judeo-Christian Western culture. So we should also note here, these texts are important because later texts looking back are going to be written from the Rabbinic tradition, which this is an overly broad statement, but more or less comes from the Pharisaic tradition. So it's going to be written from that point of view. We even see in the Talmud refers to meaning, which means sectarians, and it's referring to at times Sadducees. So here we're going to see a different point of view before the Rabbinic Jews, quote unquote, win. Okay, it's also to a degree helps us fill in the gap between the end of the Torah's story. Now, what do I mean by the end of the Torah story here? So if you look at basically Ezra, Nehemiah, Chronicles, which scholars believe actually may have all been one book at one point, basically the historical story is carried down to around the year 450, 400 or so, where Ezra and Nehemiah are there, and they're starting to really, they're rebuilding, the Second Temple had been rebuilt, but they're really establishing a presence there and rebuilding what ultimately becomes an independent Jewish state after they win independence from the Seleucid Greeks a couple hundred years later or so. So that's where the Torah itself carries the story down to. The Torah doesn't talk about Alexander coming through the Near East in 332. Now, that's not to say books of the Torah weren't added later on. Certainly, they think Megillah Esther was added, from a historical point of view, was added later on. Shir HaShirim, some even suggest Rabbi Akiva in 135 added, and 135 of the Common Era Bible added in. But as far as a narrative story, it goes to about 400 or so. So what the Dead Sea Scrolls do is kind of filling in gaps here and telling us what's going on between 400 or so, and when you really start to have rabbinic texts like the Mishnah start to become prominent. And the Mishnah was codified in the year 200 of the Common Era, so we're dealing with a large period of time here. Now there are other contemporaneous, more or less contemporaneous sources to the Dead Sea Scrolls, at least the latter scrolls. We have Josephus in the 1st century. We have apocryphal scrolls, which apocrypha is the Greek word meaning hidden. These were scrolls which were basically in consideration to be part of the Jewish canon, but were not accepted by the rabbis, which were later on put into the Septuagint. That's the Greek version of the Torah when it was translated. Just like we have an English translation, you had Greeks in places like Jews in Alexandria, Egypt, who spoke Greek, not Hebrew, and needed a translation. Well, they had their own Greek Bible translation, and they put in these apocryphal stories. They put in the book of the Maccabees, which isn't in the Jewish version, as well as there's all sorts of other ones such as Jubilees and things like that. We're going to talk about. There's also pseudepigrapha, which was preserved by the Eastern churches, and pseudepigrapha is basically writings that were done in somebody else's name. Nowadays you say, well, that's outrageous, that's fraud to use somebody else's name. In the area we were dealing with, there was nothing wrong with this. This was considered perfectly normal. It was simply a way of giving your work more prestige by putting it in the name of somebody who was already a prominent figure. So that's what it's saying here. Okay. So we have three types of texts, and in a sense, Qumran was structured like a library. Just in a library, you'd have different type of sections where you could find different type of books. So 25% of these books or so seem to be biblical in nature, or really old manuscripts of biblical works. Then you have these apocryphal works as well, which I mentioned, and there it is. And we also have sectarian texts. The sectarian texts are texts which apply directly to the sect in Qumran. So the first two group of texts basically are just biblical, or now we'd say apocryphal, but basically were just texts that were considered biblical in nature and revered in nature during this time period. But then you have 38% of these texts talk directly about how people in the Qumran sect are supposed to live. And these texts, they believe, unlike the others, were written primarily at Qumran. Most are Hebrew, but we have a few in Aramaic as well as Greek. So we'll open it up to Q&A, and next week we're going to talk about in the modern era what happened after we'll talk about the scrolls being found. I know a lot of you are familiar with the general story about how they were found, but also why there was such a delay in publication, and then we'll go dive back into the ancient world again next week too. To start looking at some of these scrolls. So let me exit out of the screen share. Okay, let's open it up to Q&A.
I just have a comment to make. So when
Lydia.
When I was touring in Qumran, they said that they had proved that when Jesus was like missing for 10 years of his life, they can't account for it, that this is where he was in Qumran.
So, I'm sorry, so who said that?
The tour guide that I had.
No, but I'm sorry, where were you?
In touring Qumran.
Oh, in Qumran. Okay, I've never heard that. Scott, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I haven't heard that.
Okay, so go ahead, Lydia.
Well, I had something to add to that.
Susan, go ahead.
There's a class that's being taught at Lifelong Learning by a guy who follows the whole Qumran archaeology, and one of the main discussions was the issue of was Jesus an Essene, and so that discussion is flopping about. Nobody really knows for sure, but his and the end of the world scenario, which is, the end of the world is coming, the end of the world is coming, which he pursued as also Paul, that separated him from the Sadducees particularly, was part of the discussion as to whether Jesus was really in a scene or whether he is part of some other sect.
Okay, so what I oh, Scott, go ahead. I saw your hand.
No, I was following up in that last comment. Remember when you brought up the word Essean itself, which people just don't know the source of, because most of these things they're either from Josephus or other writings in Greek and the Hebrews that, if they are the source of these words, are corrupted. But one theory is that the word Essean comes from the Hebrew word osim, do, does, deeds. These people were doers of the Torah. And that becomes important because one of the big clashes at the time with James and Paul is this idea of faith over osim, works, deeds versus faith. So that's another clue as to who these Esseans could be. If they had that kind of name of osim, is these people were Torah followers. They were osim, doers. So if this person of Jesus ever was part of that, if that person emphasized works over faith, that could also be an indicator of, these people that are populating or living in that area.
All right, interesting. The theory I heard, and no one knows if it's true or not, but it's speculation that Jesus was part of an Essene group that was less radical. In other words, didn't go off into the desert and live basically a secluded life. If you look at historical records and Christian teachings about Jesus, he's in communities with people reaching out, and certainly the Qumran sect took the opposite point of view. So the theory is that being that the end of the world type scenario certainly fits into the Essenes and Jesus on one hand. On the other hand, he wouldn't have been comfortable with the seclusion of the Essenes. So as far as was he ever a Qumran, I mean, it's an interesting theory. And being that he, as Lydia said, he may have dropped off the radar and is missing parts in his life, it's not particularly surprising someone might say this is a place for a while he was, even though he probably had a different point of view. I mean, with all of these historical things, we're dealing with limited information. And as Bart Ehrman, who's a leading scholar on Christianity and Christian scriptures, points out, that the Gospels, for instance, dealing with the life of Jesus, the earliest one we have is Mark, which is dated to about 65 or so, something along those lines, is about 35 years or so after he died. So it's like looking at an event 35 years earlier and then saying, well, how accurate is the information? You're going to usually have a mix of accurate information as far as myths and legends and half-true information. So it's fascinating, and to see even today what people are suggesting. Anyone else? Marty Cohn.
Yeah, I always thought that the reason why the book of the Maccabees was not included in the Tanakh because the Tanakh was closed before the period of the Maccabees. But you're saying that the Tanakh was closed in the Common Era, which is after the Maccabees. So what was the reason that those books were not included?
Oh, the rabbis hated the Maccabees. It's pretty. I mean, they had not. When I say hated the Maccabees, I'm not talking about the first generation, Judah Maccabee, independence, all that type of thing. A generation or so later, basically, his nephew becomes a relatively harsh king. And then they take over they take over the kingship, as I said, as priests, not from the house of David. They had no right to that. And I believe the Yehuda Hanassi, who canonized the Mishnah, claimed Davidic descent also around that time period. He probably thought that the latter Maccabees were basically interlopers of sorts. So the rabbis basically, that was a political decision as opposed to historical timing. Scott, go ahead.
Another interesting theory might be also the Maccabees 2, I guess. I don't know about Maccabees 1, but Maccabees 2 itself is written for the Jews of Alexandria, Jews of Egypt. It opens up by being a letter to the Jews of Alexandria. And we understand from that the author, who was called the epitomator, I think, or something in Greek that means a copier. He said, I'm copying from Jason of Cyrene, who has a big volume, but I'm condensing it. My feeling might be, it's just a theory, that the Maccabees, or at least the second Maccabees, was never written in Hebrew. It was probably written in Greek so that the Jews of Alexandria or the other communities in Egypt can understand it. And maybe the rabbis just felt it wasn't a Hebrew text. Even though it was talking about the Jewish event in Judea, it was written for Jews in Alexandria. And maybe they just felt that, if it wasn't originally written in Hebrew, it won't be.
Right. So one of the things that Schiffman points out that these scrolls really do, and we see, is it lets us look back at ancient texts such as these apocryphal texts, Maccabees, Jubilees, and these type of works. And before, we only had these works basically which were already in Greek. So it's going to go back, at least to a degree, and give us little tidbits and segments of what these texts look like in the original Hebrew. Now, if my memory is correct, 4 Maccabees, I think, is placed, basically doesn't really have anything to do with the revolt against the Greeks. It's basically written to the Jews living in Alexandria. It just happens to be called Maccabees. I'm not sure why even, really. Okay. Anyone else?
So I'm sorry. On your slide where you were talking about what % of the Dead Sea Scrolls were biblical, and it didn't add up to 100. It looked like you were missing about a fifth. Was that?
Yeah, I just copied down Schiffman's math. I'm not really. I said I actually meant to add it up myself, and didn't. Let me see unless I just miscopied it, which is also possible.
Well, what I was going to ask is, in some ways, your slide makes the Dead Sea Scrolls less interesting. I thought there was more commentary about life in general. So you have the parts about the Torah and Isaiah, and then the Qumran community itself. But there's not much. We don't learn. Can we learn much about the world outside of Qumran? Was there any discussion about?
Yes, there's a lot of discussion. Yeah, there is actually a lot of discussion, because what it does is it is a lot of juxtaposition between the Qumran sect and the contemporary Jewish world at the time. Oh. So you will not be disappointed. It's not simply a collection of old texts, and here we are in Qumran in our library studying our own text all day. There's going to be a lot of polemics and back and forth, and also we're going to see different variations of ancient texts as well. So that just seeing the variation in ancient text itself shows what was going on during these time periods. Once the text gets closed down and we have a standardized version, it's harder necessarily to see those fault lines that may have been apparent to someone living at the time. It's like reading editorials in the newspaper versus 100 years later reading about something in a history book. The history book will just tell you this is what happened basically, or maybe this is what this guy said. But when you're reading something in real time in the newspaper and getting different points of view, you get a much richer view for what's really going on here. So it may have been also that these are just estimates, and there may be estimates. So that's why it may not have added up to 100 as well.
Rabbi,
okay. Karen.
Art and I saw the Dead Sea Scroll exhibit in New York because we didn't know that it was coming to Philadelphia. And one of the things that surprised us was the War Scrolls. Which category would you put them in?
That's a sectarian scroll, where this is really you're getting their view on what's going on. Mm-hmm. So all of the manual of discipline, the war scroll. I forgot. I have it down here, but that's the other big one, the Damascus document. So, and we're going to spend a fair amount of time going over these scrolls in particular, which are really going to give us a view of the way they see themselves and the way they see the rest of the Jewish world and their view for the end of days as well. They're very big into this apocalyptic type of idea. So I should mention, I listened to another Dead Sea Scroll series that Karen lent me once by the Teaching Company, which was also very good. And I forgot the guy's name, but he was actually a student of Schiffman. Karen, do you still have that series?
Art would have it. Yeah.
Okay, and maybe I'll
We
maybe
can
I'll
run and
swing
get
by.
it. We'll run and
Maybe
get it
I
right
should-
now.
Okay, well, maybe I'll swing by and borrow it from you again, to add on, because he was also very good.
Sure. Rabbi,
Okay.
are you going
Yes.
to talk? Another thing that we found fascinating was that they put God's name in a more ancient script. Are you going to talk about that at all?
Yes, we'll get to that. Yes,
Okay.
we'll get to different way, the nomenclature, different ways of referring to God. Of course, these are all, particularly in the ancient world, names were very powerful and very symbolic. So we'll talk about all these things. And they also, I see you, Scott, just 1 minute. They also dabble in duality as well, where like God versus the devil, some sort of devil type of being. Where in Judaism and normative Judaism, that would be considered a form of heresy, because at the most, Satan is an angel of God, but he works for God. He doesn't oppose God. They really got into more like a clash between different powers. So we'll get into that as we start to study the sectarian scrolls they have. Scott?
Yeah, one other thing that Kara mentioned, another interesting point is, I don't know if you're going to talk about it, but just the scrolls getting released to the public in itself is a story.
Right, so that's what I meant.
The point about the different types of scroll, the biblical ones or the apocryphal ones, they were released quickly, but the sectarian documents, they weren't released for like nearly 40 years. And once they were, which nobody could understand, why are they holding up the release of these?
Right, so that's what next week I'm going to start, before we get into more what the scrolls, more like what the scrolls actually say. We're going to talk about, as Schiffman calls it, publication and scandal, why it took 40 years or so for a lot of these documents to get out. You think these are great historical treasures. People couldn't wait to start seeing what they said, but they just dropped off the radar screen for a long period of time.
And it wasn't because it was hard to translate. I mean, it was...
Right, it wasn't like someone was scratching his head saying, oh, I just don't know what this means. There was a lot of other games going on. Okay, anyone else?
You mentioned sort of quickly, the Essenes formerly thought you should not have children, or just turned out they didn't have very many children? I mean,
No, I believe it was some of them. It said there's basically no really point having children because the end of days is coming. Does anyone remember if that was all the Essenes?
I
don't-
heard levels of Essenes. Some were families,
Mhm.
and they had higher ranks where they didn't have children. You know, as you got more celibate, I guess the thing, you would go higher in rank. That's how that.
Okay, so that makes sense. Yeah, so like in the back of my mind somewhere, it's saying that at least some Essenes did have families. So that certainly makes sense. So Karen just sent me a text message. The other scholar is Professor Gary Rudensberg. Thank you, Karen. So,
Rensburg.
okay,
He's the
Rensberg, thank you.
Yeah. If Karen can't find her, I have it too by Gary Rensburg.
Oh, okay.
He did a
Yeah,
really good course on Genesis.
A course in what, Irene?
On Genesis, Gary Rensburg. So I mean, he's an
Oh,
excellent
I'd
teacher.
love to. Yeah, I'd love to borrow that one too. Yeah, I remember he's a teacher somewhere in Jersey.
Yeah, I think Rutgers.
So, Rutgers. Well, yeah, he was also excellent. Absolutely. So,
Rabbi?
Melissa.
Yeah, so I had read a book about first century Judaism, and the book said that the Essenes and the Sadducees were both priestly gatherings. And so it seems to me that if we're talking about Jesus, I don't think he was a Kohen. So it seems questionable whether or not he would be associated with these groups.
Right. So what I think it means, and I suggested earlier that it's believed that the Essenes probably they were priests too, but they were unhappy with the Jerusalem priesthood, so they broke away. What seems to have happened is not. I don't think it had to be a card-carrying priest to become an Essene. They had followers, I think. So if Jesus was an Essene, he wouldn't be a Kohen, he wouldn't be a priest, he'd probably be someone who joined the Essenes movement. And we're going to talk about how the Dead Sea sect in particular for a while seems to be leaderless. And eventually they find this teacher of the righteous who opposes the evil high priest. Of course, God forbid any of these people be named so we actually know who they are, instead of historians try to figure out who they are. But we'll look at all of these figures, and they'll give us quite a window into what was going on during the time period. All right, Marty Cohen.
Isn't it true that for the first 40 or so years that the Dead Sea Scrolls were in the hands of a certain panel of Christian scholars, where they wouldn't release many of the books because they were afraid that it was going to make a schism or whatever in the Christian churches, or is somehow I thought I read.
Yeah, so they drop off the radar. I have to, quite honestly, haven't reviewed the information for next week, which we'll be talking about this next week. Do you know more about it, Scott, off the top of your head?
It was a part of the Catholic Church called the École Biblique, a French organization, and they had connections with the Jordanians. And while Israel's fighting for its life in 48, Israel couldn't even get involved to try. They were just trying to stay alive, and apparently this École Biblique was able to obtain access to the scrolls, and they were the ones that became the ones that would translate and release the scrolls under their authority. And I think later the Israeli Antiquities Authority gets involved with them and has some kind of arrangement with them. But what Marty was saying, it's École Biblique, I think is how you pronounce it, a French Catholic organization.
Yeah, so if my memory is correct, like as Scott is talking, some of this is coming back to me. I listened to these lectures the first time years ago already, but I believe it was Yigal Yadin, he was an Israeli general as well as an archaeologist, who excavated Masada, who was influential in really getting him back and starting to have scholars look at them and publish them, and that put the ball in motion for them being shown to the world.
If I might interrupt, what happened to my understanding, it was given to Catholics in order to ensure, shall we say, impartial translation. However, the chief translator happened to be an anti-Semitic priest who was also a drunk. And later on, this was leaked to a man named Herschel Shanks, who edited biblical archaeology. And he was the one who actually published this. It was done surreptitiously, shall we say.
Yeah, the person's name was John Strugnall, I think his name was.
Yes.
Strugnall, who was on the board or part. He was known not to like Jews, and he pushed back a lot. Yeah, there was a lot of I don't know what's the word, but partisanship about this. There wasn't even the scholars that translated them. They didn't even treat them under the. You'll see them smoking, using Scotch tape. I mean, even the way that scrolls are handled is horrific, and that even the fragments that we hear about, the fragments weren't caused by time, but it was because they would make offers to the kids. Hey, go get me. I'll give you a shekel or something. If you give me a piece, go back into the caves and get more of the scroll. They would tear them and then bring back pieces. So the scrolls themselves weren't treated in a scientifically proper way. That's another story in itself too. That it was just handled awfully. That some of these scrolls could have been more preserved, but we'll never know.
What a shame. Okay, so unless anyone has anything else, we'll end the session. Does anyone have a last concluding comment?